Hello, in this video I want to talk about the concept of no self, and in particular I want to talk about this in regards to perennial problems in philosophy dealing with questions of the self and the nature of the self, and questions of if there's a self, and in regards to the problem of self, and why is it that we have a sense of self in the first place, as well as if we have a sense of self, well, is there no self at all? Because if we have a sense of self, doesn't this defeat the purpose of there being no self? And likewise, this is very similar to the idea that there is something rather than nothing, that we are having an experience, that there is some experience rather than no experience. And this is what gives us this concept and idea also of the self as something as having some sense of what it's like to be a mind, and thinking about the self, and what's meaningful in regards to having a mind as an individual, that gives these ideas and notions of a self in relation to others and other individuals, as well as objects within our surroundings in relation to us as individuals. And so the self and the problem of the self very much arises the sense that we have a self, that there is a sense of what it's like to be us, to be an individual, and not just an individual, but what it's like to be an individual with unique characteristics and personality characteristics, and to develop a self-awareness and self-knowledge in particular. So if there is no self, then why do we have a sense that we are different from others, or why do we have these individual self-expressions, and how come we can express ourselves, and why are there these terms that regard things like self-expression and the self to begin with, which are important to understanding various aspects of our being, and relating to the world in these meaningful ways, and also to discover what's meaningful to us as individuals. So questions of the self and the problem of no self, having no self, is deeply also related to the problem of meaning, as often when we think about the selves, we're thinking about what's meaningful to us as individuals, and also what is direct to defining the various characteristics that are important to us as individuals, and direct to our perceptions. And that meaning that's direct to our perceptions, and also direct to us as individuals, and meaningful to us as individuals, is part of the self. It's an aspect of the self, and it's part of that sense of self in which we're responding to these questions of no self, and in which we start to find these contradictions when we're grappling with these issues. Well, I don't seem to have these characteristics from moment to moment, and if I'm like others in a variety of other situations, then what really is the self, and what really characterizes myself as distinct, and why do I at certain times feel distinct, and why is that at times a good thing, and why at times is that a bad thing, and in particular, why is it that the meaning that I perceive that is distinct from other individuals more important for facilitating and optimizing well-being than if I were to try to perceive the world in terms of what another person finds meaningful and valuable, which tends to actually diminish the way I look at the world, and the direct perceptions that I feel in relation to that, and which often decrease well-being, and promote ill well-being rather than optimizing well-being. And that typically comes at the detriment of the self, through a lack of recognition of the self, through sacrificing the self often for another individual, for the perceptions of another individual, and a disregard for the self within the self. And we might be recognizing, or we might fail to recognize the self of another, but what we do is we sacrifice ourselves in relation to the meaning perceived by another individual. And when we go with the meaning perceived by us as individuals, and we recognize that meaning in relation to the self that we have, and the self that's direct to that meaning, and we perceive that meaning, that's when we can start to really understand ourselves. understand ourselves better through the meaning that we perceive within ourselves, rather than the meaning we perceive another individual as perceiving in regards to their self. So it's very important that we not abandon the concept of the self whenever we're addressing the problem of if there's a self or not, because there's definitely a direct sense of self and what it's like to be a self or have this concept of self that's associated with our individuality. However, the nature of the self is unknown and is largely dynamic and ephemeral in nature. So it's very difficult to put in a concrete set of terms, much like we might characterize the mind or the body and various psychological processes that are in many ways more concretely defined and observable. They're very well defined, where the self is well defined in regards to self-subjectivity, but we can't directly see that subjectivity outside our own perceptions of self. And so we fundamentally come to know the self the same way we come to know consciousness, through our direct perceptions, but we can't necessarily explicitly see the self within another or moving around in space. We tend to associate that in relation to other things. And what we tend to see when we observe the self, say, in another, it's these self-expressions and expressions of self, and also their individual meaning and how they convey that individual meaning through self-expressions and various forms of individual self-expression and their perceptions that they express in a variety of situations that are direct to their experience, and that they show a cognizance of self and awareness of self, and are much more complicated in how they perceive and operate in relation to meaning. So that's just a brief introduction to these concepts, and I'll be elaborating them further and also likely lecturing on these topics. Hope you enjoy. Bye.